Hi, my name is Daria Mizantsova and welcome to Politeka World Show. In today's show, we will talk about the following. Protests in Iran, what the outcome would be. Iran is still helping Russia with drones and planning to send ballistic rockets. How long the cooperation between Iran and Russia can exist? Is Russia using Iran as a pawn against the West? We will talk about it with our expert. Today, with us is an expert in Iran's program, Behnam Ben Televlu. Behnam, I'm happy to have you here. So let's start from the last news. US confirmed the supply of Iranian ballistic missiles in Russia. And Ukrainian military forces don't have the weapons to hit them. So how do you measure this step by Iran?
The U.S. confirmed that Russia is still interested in the purchase or interested in the acquisition, but hadn't received them yet. And then there was a couple of Israeli sources that were unnamed speaking to Axios that also talked about this, but said that it was moving much more quickly. But both sides had said that the transfer hadn't happened. But regardless, it looks like it's going to happen. It looks like it's going to be more a question of when and not if. So this tells us a couple of things. One, it tells us that the Iranians are not afraid of any of the pressure that they have received thus far for the transfers of their drones to Russia. Two, it tells us that Russia itself is intent on using these weapons against similar kind of infrastructure in Ukraine that the drones are being fired at, or potentially for more direct military purposes to replace some of its other shorter range missiles like the Iskander, where the stockpile of those missiles is dwindling. So either way, it bodes to an escalation of the Ukraine conflict, it bodes to an intensification of Iranian support for Putin, and it bodes to, at the very macro geopolitical level, a sign of the times of the continuing warming and deepening of the Russia-Iran military security and political relationship, which is not just a threat to the countries that live on Russia's borders or the countries that live on Iran's borders, but in this case, really the world, because this is a kind of a new axis forming, and it's been forming quite quickly. And there's other members in the constellation. There's North Korea, which has provided artillery to Putin for the war in Ukraine. There's the kind of the permissive political relationship with the Chinese. And then, of course, there's the other clients of these countries and partners like the Syrians, like the Cubans and the Venezuelans. So this really is kind of a new challenge to the established liberal world order. So it's not just about the fight in Ukraine, and it's not just about Iran's proliferation of dangerous weapons, because for 2 decades it's done that in the Middle East, but now these weapons, like drones, are reaching the heart of Europe, and one day potentially the missiles may too.
Yeah, but Behnam, how high is the possibility that Russia will transfer nuclear technology to Iran in exchange of ballistic rockets? Or Iran can consider that there are more losses than benefits of such cooperation with Russia? As I know, some experts estimate this situation the way that Iran at the end will understand that they more lose from such bloody, I could say, cooperation.
Well, success for Western policy, for European policy, for American policy, and really for any policy that is looking to stop Putin in Ukraine, one element of that success would be raising the cost to Iran of continuing this kind of military supply, and raising the cost to Iran of continuing to deepen that political, security, military, even economic relationship with the Russians. We know that, for instance, historically, Russia and Iran actually have a lot of historical enmity in different forms across very different kinds of regimes for almost the past 500 years at a bare minimum. But one reason the current government in Iran, the Islamic Republic, which as we see has no compunction about engaging in gross human rights abuses and repression of its own people, as well as exporting that violence and repression to its own region and now further abroad. One reason that it's moving closer and closer to Putin is because in terms of a nation state, Iran has a lot of issues with Russia, but in terms of the regime, the ultra hardline authoritarian Islamist regime of the government of the Islamic Republic, they actually see their future as further tied to the likes of not just Putin, but also Xi in China and kind of this new global club of autocrats. So we have to impose costs on all of that club because, as you can see, this club kind of bails each other out. We know in the past about the Russian and the Iranian support to Venezuela, for instance. We know in the past about the Russian and the Iranian support to Syria, for instance. There was an unconfirmed report. Again, I want to stress unconfirmed. About a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, that said Iran was interested in getting riot control equipment from the Russians. So to put down its own protests at home. So the relationship can spiral out of control. And that's why it's imperative for the West to kind of do everything it can to stop it, or if it can't stop it, to impose as many costs and to slow it down as possible. So we should be making sure that the Iranians are held to account in the Security Council. We should be making sure that every bank or business or entity that is engaging in the sale, supply, or transfer of not just the drones or the drone components or the launchers, but that is transferring the equipment, the men, the money, the trainers, is also held to account and is also subject to increasing Western financial pressure. Because if they are not faced with this cost, they will not stop the relationship. And, one reason if we ever do see, again, let's hope we don't see it, but I think all the trend lines tell us that we will see it, the ballistic missile transfer to Russia, is because Iran thinks that it's gotten away with the provision of drones to the Russians to use against Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Now, at the front of your question, and I apologize for going so long, you asked a very good point about the nuclear. While the conventional wisdom suggests that Russia would not automatically provide Iran with a nuclear weapon, I don't think Putin is going to be permissive with giving fissile material to the Iranians. There could be things that he does that helps Iran protect its nuclear program. For instance, the provision of the S-400 surface-to-air missile system. If not only they send this to Iran in exchange for Iranian assistance with the drones, but Russian trainers and advisors, that would essentially create a bubble of Russian protection, both in terms of human life and in terms of military technology around Iran's most sensitive nuclear sites. And in this way, guarantee the protection of Iran's evolving nuclear program for military purposes, making it more and more immune from Western or Israeli kind of potential kinetic attack. So I don't see the immediate provision of nuclear technology as being something that is going to happen, but we do need to think creatively because February 24 has changed all of these equations. And the provision of the S-400 and potentially with Russian trainers could be one thing that is very risky that Putin may choose to do to try to support Iran's nuclear program indirectly.
Yeah, but how do you feel? Does US has the receipt to break down this cooperation between Iran and Russia?
I think thus far, and unfortunately, the U.S. is taking a quarantined or a segmented or a stovepiped approach to this. It's not looking at it globally, meaning that it is treating the threat coming into Europe as, this is just a Ukraine-related issue, and then it's looking at the Iran issue as mostly limited to the Middle East, and it's looking at the China issue in a couple of different ways. But all of this stuff is great power competition or strategic competition. And the lesson of the Cold War is that if the Cold War was cold between the two major actors, meaning between the US and the USSR, it's because it was relatively hot everywhere else. And that means it's a reminder of the global nature of this competition. So while it is very commendable in terms of the military and political support that Washington has been trying to give the Ukrainians, and it's been actually even more kind of commendable and brave watching the Ukrainians fight for every single inch of their country that is being occupied, and with the Russians engaging in scorched earth policies, not just against infrastructure but against Ukrainian citizens and whole populations now. But I think we do need to do a lot more. For instance, these drone sanctions, they're ornamental, they're occasional. We now have just the UK kind of copy pasting the EU, which is copy pasting the US, and then the Australians kind of copy pasting the UK and the EU on these penalties. We need to move much, much more faster with them. We need to have them happen at once rather than one country do it and then wait 3 months and another country do it and wait 3 months and another country do it. And we need to come up with better export controls in the places that the Iranians have gone shopping in the past for these drones. For instance, we know there are Western parts, there are Chinese parts in some of these drones even too. So we have to work much better with industry, with commercial sectors, to stop the trade from growing at even the lowest of levels. And that is going to obviously take time and patience. And that's something that, unfortunately, you do not get to control because there's quite literally a battlefield next door in Ukraine.
Yeah, but back to US, there is on track the nuclear deal between Iran and US. So maybe Iran and US could negotiate. So if they don't send any ballistic missiles, there will be something else for them.
I think this nuclear deal is essentially dead. And even though you've seen for a year and a half the Biden administration here in Washington, which opposed the previous administration's leaving of the nuclear deal, you've seen the Biden administration try to not enforce the sanctions that it inherited, simply because it was really desperate to get this deal back, because it just wanted to briefly pause in its own mind the growth or the escalation of the Iranian nuclear program. And again, this is, in my view, a fiction, or it's a figment of the imagination of the administration, because the engine driving the nuclear program is the same engine that is driving the drone and missile program, and it's the same engine engaging in the domestic repression at home inside Iran, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And unfortunately, this deal, the way it's structured, the kind of businesses that would benefit from it, and the kind of second, third order positive effects it would have inside Iran would not be for the people, but it would be for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It would be for the banks and the businesses that have supported that Guard Corps, and it would be for the military-industrial complex that benefits and keeps that Guard Corps going. So in my view, it's high time Washington formally closes this deal. Iranian drone transfers violate an element of this deal that is enshrined in the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. All of the missile testing in the past has violated that as well. There are just so many violations here, and the Iranians have learned so much in the past year and a half that the utility of this deal is not really worth the brief pause, the 2 to 3 year pause that you might get in terms of the upward growth of the program.
Back now, excuse me to interrupt you. What should happen when Iran can decide to fight on the side of NATO, not on the side of Russia?
For Iran to have to want to recognize the utility of NATO and the Western alliance structure, you would need a fundamentally different regime in Iran. And in many ways, that is part and parcel of the protests that we see inside Iran today, and really the protests since 2017. In Iran today, you have an Islamist authoritarian society and a secular nationalist population. You have an Islamist authoritarian state, the Islamic Republic, and you have a secular nationalist population. And these two things don't mix, and it's precisely why you have these different iterations of street protests since 2017. And, the Islamic Republic, when the February 24 invasion began, for the first few weeks, it was actually echoing Russian talking points in the ultra hardline press about, NATO expansion, you can't trust the West, that finally the West got what it deserved. So that is the view of the government and the ultra hardline elite. But the society, that secular nationalist society that seeks representative government, that's been very bravely protesting for 3 months now, they are the ones who, I think, if you look at their slogans, they would have a fundamentally different foreign and security policy. But the regime right now, the Islamic Republic, that regime led by Khamenei, led by the Guard Corps, those are the people who are looking to help Putin in his death by 1,000 cuts approach against NATO. So the only way in which, Iran could ever be realigned is if there is, a fundamental change of government there.
So do you expect the fundamental changes in Iran? So some experts find similarities with the 1970s in Iran when the White Revolution came up. How do you feel about it?
So in the 60s, when the former king of Iran, the late Shah of Iran, had the White Revolution, that was a top-down kind of politically mandated socio-economic transformation of the country. But in 1979, you had a backlash not just against this, but against the late Shah's government, and it was ultimately brought in the government that is anti-American, anti-Western, anti-Israeli. That we've seen now for the past 43 years. And that's the government that is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. It's why there is such a large Iranian diaspora abroad. It has significant brain drain. That government is at odds with much of its neighbors and the regional power structures and balances there. So there are parallels to how that government came about and how the late Shah's government fell. And I would point out for your readers that, for your viewers, that the continuity of street protests, if married with significant strikes inside Iran, particularly strikes in the energy sector, the service sector, and higher education, that was a very lethal combination in the late 1970s that the revolutionaries then took advantage of and rode and pushed and ultimately got, a state regime collapsed and it moved into the movement that we know today. I think those same two forces are critical to watch today, which is the street power and the strike power. We've had about 3 months of protests now, and we've had, sporadic, incremental strikes, some nationwide, some, almost nationwide, some almost sector-wide, but they haven't been sustained. So the lesson of 1979 for the present, street protests is that, in essence, if you have these two forces come back, street power and strike power, and be sustained, it could pose a very lethal challenge to the security forces. And over time, if these street power and strike power from below are married with tougher Western sanctions from the top, it would mean that there is less revenue for the security forces to actually have if they're actually required to shoot their compatriots. And maybe you can get defections and, perhaps not listening to firing orders and things like that, and you could put the regime in more and more and more of a box. So those are the forces I would keep my eyes on, and those are some of the parallels from previous revolutionary movement.
Yeah, I got you. So the last but not the least, if we're talking about the future of Iran, is there any changes, just in a few words, for understanding of our audience? Will be the change of this regime? Because as I know, in Iran now, a lot of things are decided by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So, yeah.
And which the population has been protesting against again now for 3 months. So the future really right now, I would say, is on the streets of Iran. And we should all be taking our cues from what is happening in different cities, towns, and even villages, as that society is contesting the state.
So what will be the end of it for you? What do you feel, just in one sentence, just to understand?
Meaning, if these protests end tomorrow or if they end 2 years from now, it will not stop. This protest movement will not stop until there is a fundamental transformation of government, which means there'll be more short-term instability, not less.
But you don't know when it could be ended.
No one has a magic ball to know when it would be ended. But one thing is quite clear: the population seems to be more afraid of what the Islamic Republic would do to crack down on them more if they stayed home than they come out. Which is why, because they know they're risking their lives to go out onto the street, and that's why it's exceptionally brave that they continue to go out in the street. The one clear message since September has been they don't want the regime to reassert a new normal, and that enough is enough.
So we will see how it's going on, and it's good that people started to fight. Thank you, Behnam, for this interview. It was really pleasure to meet you, to have these answers on the questions. It was really fruitful talk. So thank you very much for supporting Ukraine, for talking with me in Kyiv here. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye. You too.
Bye. Bye. Thank you to be with us, and don't forget to be subscribed to YouTube channel Politeka World. Leave comments because your point of view is very important for us.